Okay, so we're just going to wait just a second, make sure our attendees are joining in and that they can join in all that. So we'll wait 1 minute and then we'll get started officially. And if someone wouldn't mind, can they confirm that the PowerPoint is being shown?
Yeah, it is.
Thank you. All right. Greetings and welcome to the 7th Annual Genocide Awareness Day here at San Jacinto College North Campus. Before we get started with the program for today, I want to let everyone know that if you have a question, please use the Q&A section within Zoom to post your question. We will get through any that we receive as time permits. With that said, April has been chosen as Genocide Awareness Month due to the significance April has in previous episodes of genocide. For example, the 100th Day We Won in Genocide was sparked on April 7th, 1994, which claimed an estimated 800,000 to 1 million Tutsi and moderate Hutu lives. On April 11th, 1933, the Nazis issued a decree requiring civil servants who acquired their positions after August 1st, 1914, to prove their Aryan ancestry. And April 24th, 1915, marks the beginning of the Armenian genocide, which an estimated 1.2 million Armenians were murdered by the Ottoman regime, modern-day Turkey. This is just to name 3. This event is organized to raise awareness about genocide, educate the public on the importance of genocide education, and to remember those who have lost their lives in genocide. Therefore, today, we do not forget the Armenian victims. Today, we heed the never again cry of the Holocaust. Today, we honor the victims of all genocide. I want to take a very brief moment to cover the origins of the term genocide. In the aftermath of the 1915 Armenian genocide, Raphael Lemkin struggled with the question why the killing of 1 million is a lesser of a crime than the killing of a single individual. Being a jurist and an expert in international law, Lemkin coined the term genocide in his 1944 book, Access Rule in Occupied Europe, Laws of Occupation, Analysis of Government Proposals for Redress. Genocide is a combination of Greek and Latin. Greek, or genos, which is Greek for group or tribe, and cide, which is Latin for killing. So in short, the term was developed to assist our understanding of the atrocities and the barbarity that the Armenians experienced. Later, Lemkin would apply the term to describe the atrocities committed by the Nazis in World War II. Lemkin was successful to add genocide as a part of crimes levied against the Nazis during the 1945-1949 Nuremberg trials. Lemkin's work, though, did not just end here. Lemkin's efforts continued as he pushed the United Nations to adopt the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which is considered international law regarding genocide, and it often provides the standard definition for scholars in studies. I think it's important to note, given our topic today, which I'll get to in just a second, that the 1946 original draft included political and other groups. Fearing accusations of this new crime, the Soviet Union and its allies placed pressure for the exclusion of this political and other groups, which their efforts were successful. We need to keep in mind that there are 5 permanent members to the UN: China, France, the former Soviet Union, today Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Article 2 in the convention defines genocide. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And these 5 acts are killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent loss within the group, and forcefully transferring children of the group to another group. So these are the 5 acts of genocide according to the UN Convention. So for today, as accusations of genocide are levied against the Russian government for atrocities in Ukraine by governments, world leaders, and some scholars, we thought to bring together a panel of experts from history and political science to discuss the situation and to address this question of genocide in Ukraine. So I'm going to pass it on to Kristen to provide us a brief history of the Ukrainian conflict and to introduce our panelists. Kristen?
Excellent. Good morning, everybody. Give me just a moment here. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can everybody see my slides? Okay, wonderful. So today I have been tasked with offering very brief background on the current situation in Ukraine. And as we know, this is a dynamic and developing situation. So we're going to be working with incomplete data. And so I'm not going to be digging too much into nitpicky details because we're, still learning new things every day, right? The full scope of this conflict isn't going to come into full view probably for many years. However, in the next few minutes, I just want to situate the conflict within sort of the modern context so that our viewers, particularly any students who might not be very familiar with what's going on, so that they can engage with our panelists. So first, let's talk a little bit about geography. Ukraine is located in Eastern Europe. It borders Russia. Russia is to its east, and Belarus to the north. The southern portion of Ukraine borders the Black Sea, which is going to be a key location. It's where a lot of the conflict has taken place over the last 14 months. And as we'll talk about even before that. And in our discussion today, I just want to point out a couple of locations you might hear me mention. On the eastern sort of portion of Ukraine, you have Luhansk and Donetsk. Those are going to be key places we'll talk about. Down here in the south, you have the Crimean region, which we're going to talk about. And then we have key port cities like the city of Odessa that you also may hear mentioned. These have all been key sort of locations in the Russian advance. Now, in terms of ethnicity, ethnically, 78% of the people in Ukraine identify as ethnic Ukrainians. However, the next largest minority group is actually Russians and Russian speakers. That represents about 17% of the population. And that's going to be relevant here as we talk about this war and the reasoning behind it. So the reason why there are so many Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Ukraine is because Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union. I'm not going to dig too deeply into that because it's pretty far out of my wheelhouse, but I think Dr. Fisher will have a little bit more information than I can offer there. So prior to 1991, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And then in December of 1991, as the Soviet Union was sort of in its death throes, so to speak, Ukraine overwhelmingly voted in favor of independence. But that history of connection is very key here. So looking forward, jumping ahead to 2014, we have this southern region called Crimea that is right there along the Black Sea, right? And this region was majority Russian speaking and ethnic Russians. And they voted they voted in 2014 for independence, essentially. They had already had some like anti-Ukrainian protests and other things. And so after this happened, the Russians came in and occupied that territory, which was then sort of legitimized by a referendum of the people in that region. Putin claimed that this territory was being annexed to protect the rights of Russian citizens in that area. And the international community immediately, there was sort of outcry against this occupation of Crimea. And the US imposed sanctions on Russia after this took place. And the US sold anti-tank weapons to Ukraine after this event took place. And this was sort of followed by other independence referenda in eastern portions of Ukraine in Luhansk and Donetsk. So even before the current war, which started last year, there was still already this Russian aggression in the region, right? So to give a very, very brief overview, in October of 2021, the United States military became all but certain that Russia was building up troops and amassing and planning some kind of an invasion of Ukraine. And they began signaling to the international community that Russia might be looking for some kind of false pretenses under which to invade Ukraine. Then in February of 2022, so in the winter, Putin first moved troops into those pro-Russian areas of Donetsk and Luhansk, claiming that he was just keeping the peace, right? But these areas already had very pro-Russia leanings. The United States and the UN took efforts to try to prevent a broader invasion of Ukraine, which ultimately failed. And on February 24th, 2022, Russian forces invaded Ukraine in what Vladimir Putin labeled as a special military operation. And he claimed, without evidence, that he was acting against supposed Nazi elements within Ukraine that were allegedly carrying out genocide against Russians in the country. And I think it's worth repeating that there was no evidence for any of these claims. The Russians targeted the capital of Kyiv and the second largest city of Kharkiv, hoping to oust the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky. And despite the odds kind of seeming to be in Russia's favor, they failed to take the capital, Kyiv, which was very key. March of last year was the high point of the fighting. Russian forces took the Kherson region. I've also heard it pronounced Kherson, so I'm sorry for my poor Russian pronunciation there. Hoping to take control of the Russian coast. To give you a sense of where that is, here's the map. And like I said, March was sort of the high point of this Russian invasion. The Ukrainian counteroffensive, though, was very successful. This past summer, they were able to reclaim some of these territories that had been taken by the Russians. And by November, that city of Kherson was liberated. So it showed that the Ukrainians were effectively pushing back these Russian advances. So looking at this map, you can see the current state of the conflict, right? This is the most recent map that I could find. Red shows current Russian-controlled areas. Purple are areas that were taken by the Russians in the war and then reclaimed by the Ukrainians. So you can still see that there is a lot of land still under the control of Russians at this moment. This conflict has forced hundreds of thousands of people out of their homes, leading them to seek refuge in Poland, Moldova, and even here in the United States. In terms of the role of the United States and the broader international community, Germany just agreed to send some of their Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. The United States is sending our M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, which was seen as a significant shift in policy for both countries because they had been hesitant to do anything that might be seen as provocative to the Russians. Estimates from the New York Times indicate that Russian casualties are likely in the realm of 200,000 killed and wounded, while Ukrainian casualties may be around 100,000 killed and wounded. And the United Nations has recorded for certain over 8,000 civilian deaths and over 14,000 civilian injuries. But they understand that those true numbers probably will not come into full view for quite some time. So from a human rights perspective, some of the things that we will be looking at today, why are we having this conversation about genocide and human rights? Some things that we know have taken place in this conflict. There was the Russian bombing of a maternity hospital in the city of Mariupol. There was a Russian missile strike on a train station that killed civilians. There was a bombing of a civilian theater where a bunch of people were taking refuge in Mariupol. We know that there were killings of civilians in the city of Bucha, and that was really only uncovered after that city was sort of liberated. And also the Russians have deliberately targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure and power plants. And so those are some of the things that we'll be looking at today to determine if they rise to that definition of genocide that Michael discussed earlier. These actions are certainly horrifying, as all wars are, but today our goal is to discuss the conflict within the broader historical and political landscapes with specific focus on this issue of genocide. And we are so thrilled to have these panelists with us today. So let me briefly introduce each one of them. First, we have Dr. David Fisher. He's an associate professor of history at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley in Brownsville, where he teaches courses in Russian, world, and big history. He holds a BA and an MA in Russian language and literature and a PhD in Russian history. He spent significant time living and working in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kyiv. And since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, he's made numerous media appearances in the Rio Grande Valley and is currently hosting a Ukrainian family that fled the war. Dr. JoAnn DiGeorgio Lutz, Dr. D, is a professor of political science and department head of liberal studies at Texas A&M University in Galveston. She co-edited Women and Genocide, Gendered Experiences of Violence, Survival, and Resistance. She was a Jack and Anita Hess Faculty Fellow on the Holocaust and Other Genocides with the United States Holocaust Museum and Memorial. And her current research focuses on memorialization and genocide museums as genocide prevention following mass atrocities. She's the book review editor for the flagship journal in genocide studies, Genocide Studies and Prevention, an international journal. And finally, we have Dr. Gary Uzonyi, who earned his PhD in political science from the University of Michigan in 2013. He's currently an associate professor at the University of Tennessee-Knoxville's Department of Political Science, where he researches and teaches on topics related to genocide, civil war, and international security. He's the author of a book and over 20 peer-reviewed articles on these subjects. He also serves as a senior research fellow at the Budapest Center for Mass Atrocity Prevention and as the incoming vice president of the American Political Science Association's Human Rights section. We are so thrilled to have all of these people here with us. So thank you so much for being willing to join us. So the way things are going to go today is that we are going to start with some questions that we have developed for the panel, but we would love to get some questions from the audience as well. So if anybody has questions, please use that Q&A feature down at the bottom to send in your questions. And then at the end of today's discussion, we'll hopefully get some time to ask those questions, right? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And the first question that we're going to talk about today is actually going to, I think, speak to Dr. Fisher's expertise. So we'll start with him. Dr. Fisher, could you just take a moment and tell us a little bit about the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine?
Sure, glad to. I hope I could have 2 moments, but I'll try not to be too wordy. The history of Russia and Ukraine goes back centuries. It goes all the way back to the 9th century. And there are some signal moments, I think, between now and then that help us understand the current situation. And I think generally the story is 2 political states that grew out of one ancestor state have been separate. And in the Ukrainian case, we see Ukrainians trying to work out a way to have an independent state. So between the 9th and 12th or 13th centuries, Kiev was the capital of a large Slavic state, Kievan Rus. It went almost from the Black Sea up to the Baltic, includes parts of modern day Ukraine, Russia, Belarus. And Moscow was one of the towns that popped up in it under the rule of a dynastic family. And they flourished during that time up to the early 1200s when the Mongols invaded. So if the Mongols have ever shown up in your history experience, you know they created the largest land empire known to humans, and the Slavic lands, or the Rus lands as they were known, were on their periphery. And that the takeaway from that invasion is it brought Kievan Rus to an end. And it created kind of two regions, one where Moscow became predominant, and the area where the Ukrainian, or the people we now call Ukrainians, lived, they were never able to quite get a state together. So as Moscow grew, they worked well with the Mongols, became really good tax collectors. They became the predominant state of the Rus in the northeastern part of what had been Rus lands. And down the area where we now call Ukraine, there was a lot of competition. Poles and Lithuanians competed to dominate there. Ukrainians themselves, they don't really take on that name until the 15 or 1600s. But this is where Cossacks are from. And the Cossacks were trying to create an independent state as well, which they were able to do for a while in the 1600s and 1700s. Unfortunately for the Ukrainian lands, their princely line died out while the Muscovite princely line was very successful at having a steady reign. So in the Ukrainian territories, there's this competition between Poles, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians themselves to create a state that goes on throughout the 15 and 1600s. And then a real signal moment in this history between Russia and Ukraine, which Putin has referred to, is a treaty that was signed between Ukrainian Cossacks and the Muscovite Tsar in 1654, right? So almost 400 years ago. And the Cossacks signed the treaty because they needed an ally. Ukraine has got so many neighbors, which you saw in the map, that at that time, they had these really powerful neighbors, Poles to the north, Ottoman Turks and Crimean Mongols to the south. And they're always looking for allies. And so in the competition with the Poles, the Cossacks signed a treaty with the Russian Tsar, the Muscovite Tsar, and they completely misunderstood each other. In fact, they had grown so far apart in the 400 years since the Mongol invasion that they needed interpreters at that meeting to work out the treaty. So during those 400 years, what had been people of sort of one general culture, they became separate people with some ancestral roots, you know, the same way the Italians, the Spanish, and the French have roots in the Roman Empire, say. The Ukrainians and the Muscovites have roots in the Kievan Rus Empire. Anyway, in that treaty, the Tsar thought the Cossacks are subordinating themselves to me, and the Cossacks thought, like, we have a contract, kind of like a Western European style contract, where the Tsar will help us defend ourselves. So there's misunderstanding that goes all the way back that far. That misunderstanding came to a head in the early 1700s when Sweden invaded this area, and the Cossacks expected Russia to help them defend against the Swedes, which they didn't. So the Cossacks kind of split their loyalties and switched sides to fight with the Swedes against Peter the Great. And it was a disaster. They lost. So since they lost, in the 1700s and 1800s, what you see is the Ukrainian territory is pretty much divided up between its powerful neighbors. Russia occupies and colonizes the eastern part. The Poles are active for a while in the western part, then they're replaced by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Ukrainian people and their language and ethnic traits don't disappear. They just don't have a state. They're divided up into different states. But World War I gives them an opportunity, kind of in that spirit of self-determination, which we saw when empires broke up, that they briefly declared an independent Ukraine, right? So that dream was alive. It didn't last long at all. It just wasn't sustainable. There was too much competition. The Russian Revolution had taken place, and the Bolsheviks, who had thrown out the Tsar, executed him and his family, and taken over the government, also conquered Ukraine. Some Ukrainians were on the Bolsheviks' side. It's a very complicated place. But Ukraine then became incorporated into the Soviet Union. And the other sort of signal moments here that I think speak to the issue of genocide and Genocide Awareness Day are what is recognized by many as an act of genocide in Ukraine from Moscow in the 1930s, when the Soviet policy of collectivization was underway, which basically meant you take family farms and you turn them into big company farms or corporate farms or communist farms. It means you're taking the land and animals and things away from people and kind of making them workers in a factory farm. Well, Ukrainians resisted. And so where people look for evidence of genocide here is in state policies that persecuted Ukrainian farmers that revolted, and especially in the famine that took place in mostly in 1932, in order to feed the rest of the Soviet Union and to build new factories and whatnot. The Soviet government intentionally, not everybody agrees with this, there's a little bit of disagreement on this, but the genocide argument is that the Soviet government under Stalin intentionally took grain out of Ukraine, even the grain you need to plant seeds for the next year, and caused a famine. Conditions were already bad in many parts of the new Soviet Union, but what Ukrainian scholars and others point to is that there were particular policies by the government of the Soviet Union executed in Ukraine that persecuted people of Ukrainian ethnicity, removed food that caused famine. About 4 million people died in 32, 33. And then they purged the Ukrainian, they purged the Communist Party in Ukraine of ethnic Ukrainians. So this is a signal point where Ukrainians have a memory of genocide already happening at the hands of the government from Moscow. And then if we just come forward, Ukraine suffered dramatically during the Second World War. About 1 million Jews living in Ukraine died in the Holocaust, already recognized as genocide. Ukrainians were torn in their loyalties. Some fought with the Red Army. Some actually joined the Nazis. The explanation behind that is Ukrainians, although nationalism, racism, all those things exist there, were trying to find a path to independence. And some thought they might get it from the Nazis. They were terribly wrong. Others thought they might get it within the Soviet Union. They were also wrong. So the history with the Ukrainians and what they see as the Muscovites is fraught. In 1991, the Ukrainians voted for independence. The Soviet Union collapsed about 3 months later. In 2004, Ukrainians came out on the street in what's called the Orange Revolution to show their preference for a presidential candidate who wanted closer ties with Europe against one that wanted closer ties with Russia. They were also against corruption, and they won, right? So democratic forces came out on the street and they made the election happen again, and the European-leaning candidate got elected. The other signal moment is if you fast forward to 2013, a Russian-leaning president was in power and intentionally veered away from connections with the European Union, didn't sign a trade treaty with the European Union, and people came out on the street to protest. This blew up into what's called the Revolution of Dignity, in which Russian Russian police forces helped the Ukrainian president to intervene, bringing snipers out in a huge melee in the main square in Ukraine. But it resulted in the Russian-leaning president having to flee, and he fled to Moscow, where I believe he still lives today. So Ukrainians are very proud of their efforts at being independent from Russia. But as we heard earlier, that precipitated in 2014 Russian forces annexing Crimea and invading or putting forces into eastern Ukraine, which escalated into the invasion in 2022 that we're in right now. So I'm sorry to, I tried to take just a moment, but you can just see there's a very long history. And when Putin talks about Ukrainians and Russians being one people, he's going back centuries and centuries. Ukrainians, though, have clearly demonstrated that under our current understanding of national sovereignty, they clearly are a national group.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And you kind of touched on this briefly. I just wanted to give you a chance to elaborate on it if you choose. You sort of talked about the famines and the purges. Can you just tell us a little bit about, like, with regard to Ukraine or more broadly, what Russia's human rights record has kind of been like up to this point?
Oh, okay. Well, if we just fast forward and look at the Putin years, which he was appointed as a prime minister in '99 and then became president in 2000, then he's been reelected several times. The general human rights tally of abuses have clearly gone up under Putin. And it basically centers on, as I see it, Putin's centralization of authority in his own hands, like pulling it away from sort of democratic forces, means that there have been human rights abuses in a variety of ways. But just take like assassination and or unsolved assassinations and what seems like unjust imprisonment under very dreadful conditions. And that's happened to businessmen or business people that with their wealth threaten the Putin narrative. It's happened to opposition politicians who have been assassinated, like Boris Nemtsov was a leader of the liberal movement, was shot dead just outside the Kremlin. Extraordinary, unsolved. Journalists who criticize the abuse of power, murdered or imprisoned, and peaceful protests generally not allowed, as well as crackdowns on the media. So there's quite a list of increasing human rights abuses, but they're pretty much tied. They're tied directly, as I see it, to the centralization of political and economic authority in Putin's hands, or in the hands of a small oligarchy at the top of the Russian political system.
Excellent. Thank you. So now I can open it up to any of our other panelists if you have a perspective. So when speaking at the Munich Security Conference, Vice President Kamala Harris stated, quote, "In the case of Russia's actions in Ukraine, we have examined the evidence, we know the legal standards, and there is no doubt these are crimes against humanity," end quote. Similarly, President Biden came out and said that President Putin was committing acts of genocide by, quote, "trying to wipe out the idea of a Ukrainian identity." So my question for any of our panelists is, at what point do crimes against humanity or human rights abuses cross the threshold over into genocide?
I can kind of start the discussion on this. Thanks, Kristen. I think we need to, well, President Biden did come out and call Russian actions in Ukraine genocide. He also had to walk that comment back almost immediately. And he had to say that this is a personal opinion that he held, and that any determination of genocide was the responsibility of the State Department and the international lawyers. So that also begs the question why we're always reluctant to call genocide genocide in many instances. I think if you take the UN Convention as the legal standard, as the defining idea of genocide, that threshold really has to be, according to the convention, intent. And this is, of course, the most difficult thing to prove, to demonstrate intent. And of course, it kind of spills over into that sort of next question, I think, in many ways, is that because you're seeing right now a huge divide among academics, political elites, even legal scholars, on whether or not we can demonstrate this particular intent. I'll let my colleagues kind of follow up on that if they want.
Gary, did you want to add something?
I think JoAnn's nailed it, right? The big distinction is the intent. Crimes against humanity can be the killing of a large number of individuals, but if the intent is not to destroy the group as a group, we don't usually see the event crossing that boundary into genocide. And I think, again, she nailed it as well when she said it is very difficult to prove intent. There's quite a lot of work right, the courts have to go through to establish both the guilty act and the guilty mind, just as in proving homicide at a much lower level. So I think that's it, right? And I think, as Kristen mentioned at the very beginning today, there's still going to be a lot of information coming out over the years as to what exactly is going on and the intent, right? The policy, how it's crafted and why it was crafted the way that was.
So I would just add to that, I've been tracking a little bit on what Ukrainian scholars are saying and scholars of Ukraine are saying. And so what they will very forthrightly say, oh yes, this is genocide. And so I'm just kind of reporting what I see them saying, but what they point to at trying to, there's no trouble listing the war crimes. You know, if you just follow the UN Convention on War Crimes, they're very well documented in Ukraine by the Russian forces there. So when they try to go for intent, some of the things people are pointing to are, say, Putin's speech the day before the invasion, and things that he says about denying that there is a Ukrainian identity, denying that a Ukrainian state exists. You know, using language like, in quotes, final solution of Ukrainian question, that just rings very poorly. You see that in Russian propaganda about the war. People argue that there's clearly a political and military intention that's aimed at the group, right? That's aimed at people who identify as Ukrainian. And one of the things maybe we'll talk about later is how I think Ukrainian identity is shifting from just ethnicity to a civic identity, right? Like we've seen pro-Russian leaning people in Ukraine come out against the war and say, I'm not for invasion, I'm Ukrainian, right? Even though ethnically and linguistically they might be Russian, but they see it as a struggle about identity, not just territory. They'll point directly to point 5 in the Genocide Convention, I think that Michael pointed out, about transporting children from one group to another. There's clear evidence of that, whether that's on a level that people say, well, yeah, that fits, but it's clearly happened. Ukrainians being deported into Russia, territory in Ukraine occupied by Russia, where Ukrainian history, culture, language is completely taken out of the schools and it's replaced with a Russian curriculum. So they see this genocidal pattern of violence. They see it in the bureaucracy. For example, the Russian Division of Children's Services, whatever they call it, is actually the one involved in deporting children and then putting them up for adoption with Russian families. They see a kind of society-wide set of enablers among religious leaders and the media who dehumanize Ukrainians as a people. So I agree. I mean, yeah, the intent is sort of the key thing that the scholars and legal experts and our friends on the panel look for. Ukrainians are already trying to list those things so that others can engage with them.
I also think, if I can build on what David was saying, I think it's a question of approach. I was reading something by Martin Shaw, who said that if you approach the Russian invasion not as an invasion and subsequent genocide that's taking place, but an actual genocidal war that he implemented, then you can go back and, like what David was saying, take Putin's own words And what she's talking about, that we have to eliminate this because they see it as an existential threat, Ukrainian identity to Russia. And in Putin's essay, I think he wrote that like right before, about the month before the invasion, he also talked about how Russian spiritual unity was being attacked. That there was an ecclesiastical kind of threat as well, in addition to this sort of linguistic or national threat. So if you sort of take this approach that the intent was there and that they were actually going to wage a genocidal war, then it becomes, then I think the evidence is there that you can almost demonstrate intent. I think the reluctance to maybe do that is they want that case to be ironclad. And I think if we go back in many instances and look at previous genocides, that smoking gun is not always there. So this is what I think maybe complicates things a little bit more in this process. So.
And if I may just add one final point, though, I think part of the question is coming up here. A lot of what David pointed to surrounds the destruction of culture, though whether or not the destruction of a group's culture constitutes genocide is an idea that is still quite debated. Right? The destruction of a group has traditionally been understood as the physical destruction. And so even if you see these words or statements which are clearly about the culture of the group, the existence of a group as the idea, do the acts themselves, do the policies themselves, are the goals or the intents really about the physical destruction of the group, I think is also where we get a lot of hesitation as to whether or not crimes against humanity or war crimes are actually to the level of the destruction of a group in the sense of genocide.
Also wonder too if I know Zelensky uses it quite frequently, and I think he's using it to stir, like using it more from a emotive or an emotional sort of projection, because if you remember what Lemkin wanted, he wanted that when you heard that word, you knew there was no ambiguity what was taking place. And I think I'm wondering if Biden is using it more in terms of a political a tool and not necessarily a legal sort of standard in many ways. So we also have to look at the way in which like individual leaders are using it or not using it in many ways as well.
I'd like to just ask Gary and JoAnn a quick question. One of the things I've heard is that foreign governments are reluctant to call it genocide, not simply because it's hard to define, which it clearly is, but if they do, then they're obligated to act. I mean, not just morally, they're like legally obligated to act within the framework of what we consider, collaboration within the United Nations or something.
Absolutely, and I think this should have been a lesson that we learned from Rwanda, which is with the reluctance to act, because we felt we had an obligation to do something. And then of course afterwards we issue apologies. But per the convention, any of the contracting parties to bring about any sort of suppression or prevention of this can work either through the ICJ or the United Nations. So it doesn't, there's nothing in there. It's a matter of interpretation of the legal document, the convention, but there's nothing in there that absolutely says states have an obligation to act. And so I think we learned that lesson from Rwanda. I'm still not certain why the reluctance to call it, what we see as a genocide. Gary may have some, he wants to add on that.
No, I think that's right. I think whether you have the legal obligation to act, or whether this is part of your responsibility to act, those are some questions. But I think largely then there is a move, right? The do something, that the pressure that builds, and sometimes it's going to be politically difficult for leaders to take the steps that perhaps their constituents would demand, or civil society in some way, especially when we're talking about these crimes across borders, right? So once you start talking about the acts in the interstate context, especially one on the border with NATO, right? I think it changes some of these calculations as compared to where we most commonly see such crimes, which are domestically. Right? And I think that largely shifts some of the calculations.
And if I may interject real quick, to build upon what y'all have talked about so far, I think we also have to look at the fact that Russia has a large nuclear capability, and that they are willing to rattle that saber at any moment. That can provide some reluctance as well to engage them on a serious level about accountability.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Paul Danieri is a political science who studies Ukraine, and he said, and maybe Gary and JoAnn can tell me if I'm thinking along the right lines, is that it's really hard to enforce, like even if there is like a decision by the International Criminal Court, how do you bring Russia to the court? Like, we're not going to get Putin in the dock. If a powerful state can let the accusations roll off its back, maybe I'm sure there's prices to pay for sure in all different ways, but like an enactment of sort of very straightforward transactional justice is probably not in the cards with a state as powerful as Russia is, despite its recent revelations of weakness.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion on that particular question. Let's transition to another question here real quick. So disagreeing with President Biden's assessment, French President Emmanuel Macron said that he is reluctant to use the word genocide, stating that he was not sure that an escalation of rhetoric solves that cause. So our question, do we need a consensus among the international community before we will see accountability, be it direct intervention, naming and shaming campaigns, or officially charging individuals of crimes of genocide? Or will we see any accountability? Gary, would you like to take that?
I can lead us. Oh, go ahead, Gary. Go ahead.
No, so go, Jen. Yeah.
Let me start us off. So, Michael, I don't think we need consensus, right? I think we need international cooperation to call it this. And if you go back and look at the convention and the legal definitions, et cetera, we can use international institutions like the United Nations, like the ICJ, et cetera. But if you look at our own State Department, this idea of justice and human rights accountability for Russia's war of aggression, I mean, this is the central pillars of our policy right now with respect to what's going on in Ukraine. But I do think it's going to take what I would call, or what even the State Department defines as unprecedented cooperation. So we are, through our own institutions like the Department of State, Justice, Treasury, USAID, are working with other organizations, other international institutions, other countries, et cetera, to try to bring this accountability in that sense. And I think it was David was just saying is that we've got multiple jurisdictions right now. We've got national, international jurisdictions, et cetera. So some of the things that we are trying to do right now is to actually develop capacity building in Ukraine itself to help document these particular atrocities, and then also to shore up their own judicial system and train like lawyers and things like that to actually, if there are going to be even trials in Ukraine, right? Say they happen to capture, any of these Russian soldiers or other, leaders, et cetera, to hold these people accountable. So we have to strengthen even the government of Ukraine's accountability efforts as well. And then a lot of this sort of like technical cooperation as well. So a lot of this is actually being done with international institutions. And then also we have to train them on war crime investigation techniques. So you need international cooperation to do this. And these sort of things take time. So even though, we want to say, okay, let's, even if we called it a genocide today, came out and spoke about it, then what next, right? So what are next steps in that sense? The other thing I think the United States is also trying to do is to support the prosecution of perpetrators, both here and in the United States. And so we've helped launch a war crimes accountability team for this, looking at these sorts of things. And my understanding is too that we've amended back in December the War Crimes Act, United States. So we're going to establish jurisdiction over these people who are present in the United States after committing war crimes in other countries, regardless of the victims or offenders, et cetera. And then we're also working with the United Nations on establishing and supporting the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. So there's a number of these multiple sort of operations that are in place, to make these kinds of determinations, but it's slow and it takes time. And unfortunately, in the process, we continue with these, war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the people of Ukraine are suffering.
And to add on, Michael, the way the question is phrased is about consensus to take any of these actions. But one of the things I think that we observe is that throughout the international system, different actors can take actions on their own, right? So one of the ways that you asked about this was with naming and shaming, right? Human rights organizations, non-government organizations, right? These are groups that can apply some pressure, some naming and shaming, for example, without broader international consensus. When we talk, I think you mentioned direct intervention. Outside of this particular case, I think we often see unilateral direct intervention when intervention occurs in genocidal cases. And so I think, consensus helps because it builds those pressures together, right? Which is increasing the costs to continuing the action, which is one of the ways in which we often think we can decrease the severity of the episode, maybe end it. But it's not necessary for any one of these actions to take place. So I think I just wanted to separate out this idea of the need for consensus versus how we get action often in the cases we've seen.
David, did you want to add anything to this?
I do not. I think my previous comments about the difficulty of bringing Russia to justice in the courts in response to your question about the nuclear weapons is my contribution.
And sorry, if I could just say one more thing on that point that David raised. We had President al-Bashir of Sudan, right? Not a nuclear power, and yet action to enforce, the ICC's indictment, et cetera, not taken, right, by the major powers. So we see kind of this limitation that David's highlighted, even for states that we wouldn't consider to be particularly well-armed or strong relative to Western powers, for example. So excellent.
Real quick, I know that the willingness, we need a will to for unilateral or even multilateral action to be taken, that there needs to be a will. And I remember from previous classes that that will is hard to find. And I wonder if I may ask, just to deviate just a little bit here, how do we begin to build up that will for some type of either multilateral or unilateral action?
I would say we already see the evidence of the will, that Putin drastically miscalculated that Western Europe and the United States would cooperate to come to Ukraine's aid. And just throwing my mind back, I can't think of any historical precedent that's as profound in terms of the amount of money from governments, material from governments, and material support from populations. There are Russians who support Ukrainians. They're somewhat muted, but when this war started, I reached out to Ukrainian friends and then realized, my Russian friends are suffering too, and reached out to them. And it's a small sample, but uniformly, they're just aghast at what's going on. So the will to help Ukraine defend itself is very strong. And my hypothesis would be that the will to rebuild Ukraine and to try to bring some sense of justice to the, to this forum of warfare is already in the cards.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. So let's move on to our fifth question here. Going back to this idea of consensus, we do lack a consensus among political leaders, as we mentioned earlier, and experts, if Russia's actions constitute genocide. So based on your professional opinion, do you believe Russia's actions meet the criteria to constitute genocide? And if JoAnn, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I do. Yes, for reasons, especially with the forcible transfer of children. I mean, if you look at the indicators of genocide, they're meeting most of them. Serious bodily harm, mental harm, what is caused on the Ukrainian people. The conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part. And that could be a dozen people, right? It doesn't have to be millions or thousands of people. The imposing of measures intended to prevent births, especially with the rapes and things like that. And then also you force the evacuation, I mean, of women and children immediately when the conflict began, right? That family sort of separation, and then the forcible transferring of children from one group to the other, and this sort of Russification of them, and they came out, I think the Russians came out and said, well, these are like, they're orphans, but you're still preventing measures of birth, you're still taking these people from, their national identity and re-educating them and giving them different parents and things like that. So yes, if you look at those as the indicators, it definitely says that to me, this is genocide. And I do believe if you go back and you look at, Putin's own words, I mean, I think the intent is there. So, in this idea of like wanting to erase Ukrainian identity and that identity and so on. And I think I was listening to a podcast not too long ago where they're actually now trying to collect radio transmissions. And there was one where it was like, hey, we're in this place here, and there was like, women and children, et cetera. And it was like, just kill them all. So they're collecting this kind of documentary evidence using like technology and things like that, and building that case. And I think at some point, yes, we're going to label it what it is and collect that documentation and evidence. So in my opinion, yes, looking at the convention, look at the indicators, looking at Putin's own words, et cetera, and acts on the ground, I believe it's genocide.
David, did you have a follow-up thought to that?
Well, I thought I'm glad JoAnn started. I thought Gary should. He's more of a specialist on this than I am. I can follow up, but I thought Gary should jump in here if he's willing.
I can follow you, David. Good.
Oh, okay. So I guess what I would say is that. Again, I would kind of like speak from the point of view of what Ukrainians are talking about. And also, the question says like our professional opinion. And I think JoAnn demonstrated that really clearly, like looking at the definition and how the intent has to be proven with evidence. I think one of the things I've noticed is that the word genocide exists in a vernacular use as well, where people, they just blend right together cruelty, crimes against humanity and genocide. And so I think for Ukrainians, they definitely consider it a genocide. They see it definitely as intentional, that it's identifying Ukrainians as the group. And again, we can just point back to the evidence that JoAnn listed. That's exactly what Ukrainians are talking about too. And in casual conversations I've had with Ukrainian friends who have much more on the ground kind of feel for it, they talk about small villages that have been in the way of the war being totally destroyed, right? So a small farming village, everybody who lives in it, homes are absolutely destroyed, not a single one left standing, and the people are either murdered or deported, maybe some get away. And so they might not have exactly like what soldiers were saying to one another, although these intercepts, I think, are proving really insightful on this topic. But they're literally destroying communities and murdering or displacing the people who live there. So that seems to meet the definition of intent.
So if we focus primarily on the physical destruction of the group and set aside the cultural destruction question that we raised earlier, then I think that JoAnn is correct that what becomes key is in the definition of genocide, the whole or in part. And I think it's correct that theoretically in part could be as low as 12 people or one person. But the ICTY appeals chamber says that in part means that the destruction must be of a substantial portion of the whole. Now, defining substantial portion becomes quite difficult. The general idea is that the intent would be that the perpetrator would destroy the group if it could, and that part of what's going to limit the extent of the physical destruction is going to be the perpetrator's ability to target those people. So on one hand, we might say, well, if the proportion of the Ukrainian population that the Russians have destroyed is quite small, I think, relative to the entire population of Ukraine. You might say, well, within the areas that they control, they've certainly engaged in the acts that JoAnn pointed out, which are the elements of genocide. But I guess there's also some question as to whether or not a genocidal actor, an actor with genocidal intent, would engage in, for example, bombings outside of the theater in a much more systematic way. Right, I think these are some of the questions that are going to be raised, right? Russia has the capacity to engage in the destruction of larger portions of the Ukrainian population and hasn't. Why not? Right, and I think that these are going to be some of the key questions to try to address what JoAnn highlighted in terms of the in part portion. Again, I think absolutely the acts that she highlighted seem to meet the definition of genocide, right? But again, that substantial thing is what I think we're going to see a lot of debate on. You know, again, yes, theoretically 12, 1, even. I've heard some debate that maybe you don't even actually have to have committed, you have maybe attempted, but haven't, right? So there's some debate about conspiracy to commit genocide, for example. So all this is going to come out, but in terms of just raw numbers and any type of proportion, I think it would be hard to argue at this point that we've crossed that threshold. But this certainly, again, I don't need to keep saying this certainly will be the point of contention. But I think it will be.
Yeah, if I could add to Gary's point, which I think is very insightful. I'm glad to hear it, because it is going to be a real problem. Because I would imagine that if we could reveal all of the intentions of the Putin government, that they would have been completely satisfied with displacing the Zelensky government out of Kyiv and then occupying eastern Ukraine from the Dnieper River that flows through Kyiv and then south to the Russian border, and that they would have been happy with a very limited, unimportant, small Eastern European Ukraine without access to the coast, existing kind of on the borders of Poland and Slovakia, Belarus. So that actually leaves what's considered sort of the heartland of Ukraine in place. And so if their intentions aren't to also move forward into that territory, then that question of proportionality is really clearly revealed geographically.
And just then to build on that, right? So we've been talking about from a legal perspective, right? So from more of a theoretical perspective, one of the kind of the key differences that scholars often point to is the goal to govern the population or govern the area in the way in which David's talking about, versus removal of those people. And so I think again that kind of, if you just set aside the legal definitions and think about the theoretical, well, what's the process that produces physical destruction of a group? It's a desire not to govern them anymore, and it doesn't seem like that is what Putin is trying to do. Right, he is trying to govern those areas, but as Russia, right? And so I think this might also raise some questions, though again, not from a legal perspective.
Well, if you also remember too what Lemkin said, he argued that genocide has two phases. One is the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group, and then the second phase is the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor on that group. So I think this, even if Russia just was satisfied with a portion of Ukraine, this is still what's happening as well, or what he would like to have happen.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I think Russification policies would be imposed on that, limited size Ukraine if that had happened.
And if I may kind of do a follow-up question here, I mentioned earlier the 5 acts of genocide. Does genocide do you have to commit every act to constitute genocide, or is it one act, just proving one of these 5 acts?
I don't think, as I interpret it, and I'm not a legal scholar, but when I look at the convention, I don't see it as or and.
Excellent. Then let's go ahead and move on then to our 6th question here. And David, I believe you have some thoughts on this one. What are some of the short-term and long-term effects of the conflict in Ukraine on the population, economy, and political landscape? What about global impacts?
So, and on the short term, I would put on the list a lot of the things that we see right now. There's displacement of millions of Ukrainians internally and abroad. So families are very disrupted, marriages, births, war casualties. So an impact, I think, on the demographics are in the short term rather severe. In terms of economics, we've seen the economy of Ukraine collapse and its reliance on Western partners to provide the budget for the military and for running the state. It's not that Ukrainians have stopped trying to conduct business. They have as best they can, but in agriculture and industry, it's very hard right now. But it is, they also have a kind of a service economy that is international, that I think is still trying to function. Trade is cut off through the Black Sea. And in terms of short-term politics, I think we're seeing kind of a new national identity form out of the political unity that has emerged in reaction to the Russian invasion. So I would put all those on the short-term list. And on the long-term list, I would say we're going to see Ukrainians go home. I haven't talked to a single one that says, I mean, there might be some that stay abroad, but most of them want to get back home and start rebuilding. There's going to be a lot of grief and memorialization for people who were lost, but families, marriages, births, civic society, all of those are going to, I think, going to bounce right back. In terms of the economy, they're going to need long-term aid for reconstruction. I just saw a figure the other day, just to demine the war areas could cost $34 billion. That to me, that's an extraordinary figure just to get back to land that you can farm and walk on. And in terms of politics, I think this new identity that I think is emerging is going to be quite sustainable. And my hypothesis would be that we're kind of seeing a shift from identity as ethnically Ukrainian, or say ethnically Russian living in Ukraine, to a civic identity of Ukrainian means independence, means democracy, means anti-corruption, means tied with Europe, means family life connected between villages and cities, means entrepreneurship, that kind of thing. And the long-term, I think the big long-term questions are, is Ukraine going to be able to join the European Union? Highly likely, but fraught. And is Ukraine going to become a member of NATO? Very difficult to say right now. Although I would just say that the most advanced and experienced NATO army on the planet is the Ukrainian armed forces. They fight with multiple weapon systems. They're integrated with every NATO country. That might be a little bit of hyperbole, but in addition to all the aid that Western military powers and others are sending to the Ukrainians, I'm sure they're gathering extraordinary intelligence about what NATO is going to do and what NATO is going to be. And we just saw Finland admitted to NATO. Sweden's probably not far behind. And so long-term, that's definitely going to be a question. The Ukrainians certainly feel that they have earned the right to be in the European Union, although they have some work to do. And they, beyond a shadow of a doubt, believe that they are eligible for NATO membership.
So let's if there's no other thoughts on that, we can go ahead and move on to another question.
Oh, I would just add that we might also ask long term for Russia. There's a political crisis brewing. Things in Russia happen by surprise. Nobody expected the revolution. Nobody expected the collapse in '91. Putin has so much power centered under his control. We don't really know what's going on there, except a lot of infighting. But I wouldn't be surprised by a collapse of the Putin government and a scramble to find some solution. Some people even predict, this is, I think the probability of this is less, but some predict a fracturing of Russia into regional states or sections. I'm not sure that might be long term. I don't know, but short term, there's a Russian political and social crisis coming.
And I believe that Uzonyi is in critical shape as well. And if anything should happen to him, what those reverberations will be as well.
Yeah, I agree.
David, you said it is coming. Do you think we might already be seeing some of that now?
Well, I think there's been a political crisis in Russia since Putin came into power. He clearly, I mean, it's been 20 years, but it was pretty clear by 2008 that he was leading Russia into a political and economic dead end, to my mind. And I'm not anti-Russian. Russian culture is full of riches. They gave us the novel. They have extraordinary brain power and resilience. It's a very strong example of one of the human civilizations that we live among. But in fact, I would argue that under different leadership, even Putin's maybe kind of oligarchical or authoritarian style, it could have made Russia into a North Asian powerhouse that dominated its sphere of influence through economics, diplomacy, cultural exchange. Maybe a little bit of pushing people around. That just seems to be the reality of politics. but instead, the path taken politically has been to kind of corrupt neighbors into becoming part of the Russian sphere of influence and not being able to tolerate independent direction. So Belarus was conquered in this way. Belarus is a satellite of Russia. Their story is kind of similar to Ukraine. They went a different route. Ukraine went for independence. Belarus went for authoritarian leadership or whatever. I'm not blaming the people. That's kind of how it turned out. Russia has extraordinary natural resources, ingenuity. They could have gone a different route. One of the problems, though, if you look back at the 1990s, is maybe that kind of entrepreneurial leadership and cultural leadership and diplomatic leadership is more likely to happen in a liberal democracy, perhaps. And the liberal democratic political movement in Russia got no traction in the 90s at all, very little. They barely broke 10%. Communists, the communists and the nationalists got much more support. And so there just really wasn't a lot of support for the idea of, constitution, rule of law, sort of toleration of different ethnic groups and ways of living. They had a chance. They had a chance in the 90s. It was a very difficult time, but people did not vote with their feet or hands or mouths for the liberal democratic parties that emerged in the 90s. So, anyway, I think there's still a missed opportunity there, but that crisis is on the horizon because there's no heir to Putin. The economic reliance on natural resources and oil exports isn't reliable. So that's why I hypothesize a crisis sooner than later.
Excellent. Let's move on to our seventh question. And so, do Russia's actions and the world's response to them embolden other state and non-state actors to commit crimes against humanity and or genocide? Are there any other global human rights struggles that are being overshadowed by the conflict in Ukraine? Gary, did you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I think it's long been suspected that atrocities diffuse across states, right? That is, that states emulate each other's actions. If one engages in atrocity and the international community is slow to respond, then others are likely to follow. However, there have been few, if any, systematic tests of this proposition across space and time, right? So it's a hypothesis I think kind of makes sense, but we haven't actually seen, to my knowledge, this dug into deeply in a way in which we could say, yes, these are the conditions that lead one state to follow another state's actions in terms of atrocity. Where this has been probed is usually in regards to how one actor's atrocities affect its opponent's use of similar tactics. So in this particular case, it would be whether Russian war crimes, crimes against humanity, etc., provoke Ukraine to do the same, right? So that's really where we've studied rather than across these different actors. And in this literature, it does seem to be the case that a tit for tat strategy is common. That is, atrocity by one begats atrocity by another. It's not clear, though, that these patterns hold up across states, right? So this is surely a proposition that needs more investigation. But I want to tie this back to a point I made earlier, which is that in most of the cases we've seen, especially since the end of World War II, of these types of atrocities, these types of crimes, they're happening domestically, right? So cross-border violence like this hasn't been what we tend to observe. And I think this is kind of like led the way in which we look at these attacks and whether they diffuse or become contagious between states. That said, I think there are at least 3 patterns that suggest that such diffusion may occur. So first, we have good evidence that armed actors learn from each other in terms of committing political violence more broadly. So for instance, civil war, we tend to believe is influenced by a learning process between would-be rebels, right? Second, governments, one of the things that we've noticed is they tend to repress when there's violence nearby them. So they kind of anticipate that violence is going to diffuse in this kind of way. We also tend to see that violence itself, so again, here I'm going to talk about the more common case where like rebels cross borders or governments chase rebels across borders, or we have refugees going across borders. When that happens, what we tend to see is a new episode of violence or conflict in the nearby country, in which that new conflict is met with a new set of atrocities. So we don't have a great idea of whether country A's action influenced country B's action, though we think so, but we do have a good sense that oftentimes these violent acts themselves are intertwined, and this leads to what might be observationally a very similar dynamic. I think there are some questions, though, as to whether or not these same patterns that I just highlighted would hold up for crimes against humanity and genocide specifically, given that such atrocities carry higher political, psychological, and military costs than these other forms of violence I've been talking about. And again, just to come back to the point that these previous, a lot of this research has focused on how governments treat their own populations, right? And so the reason that's important is because cross-border violence has been shown to have different correlates than within border violence, right? Meaning that the patterns of violence that I mentioned in interstate war don't often mirror what happens in civil war or domestic context. So a lot of the lessons learned that I've been talking about are from the domestic context where we focused, and yet we also know, at least for some other actions or aspects of war, they don't match up. And that's not even getting into the cost of those actions like genocide carries that we've been discussing more recently. So I guess if I could have said this in a much shorter way, it is we think that yes, actions by one country would lead to atrocities by others. We don't have great evidence for that, but we do have evidence that at least domestic violence does diffuse in the way that we're hypothesizing that Russian acts might be influencing acts abroad.
Mm. If I can add on to what Gary was saying, in the sense here we're talking about other global human rights struggles that are being overshadowed, I tend to think sometimes too among the American public that right now we're starting to experience what I call atrocity fatigue. So if you think like in what the media covers. So when the war first broke out in Ukraine, even on the island of Galveston here, you could walk around and there were Ukrainian flags everywhere. There were people coming out and protest and support. And then that begins to taper off. You know, now occasionally you'll see a tattered flag that somebody still has out in their yard or something like that. And of course, I think there's this kind of numbing, if you will, when we sort of hear these stories over and over. The other thing too is what's going on right now. Look at what's going on at Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem and the Israeli actions in Jerusalem against Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza right now. And the Rohingya in Myanmar, and the refugees and what's happening in the Rakhine state, et cetera. And then also, I think, what's also happening too in El Salvador right now too, and these civil rights, human rights violations, et cetera. So I think a lot of that too has to depend on, if you remember as well, during the Rwandan genocide, when many Rwandans that were in the United States approached our own State Department, and I think it was Anthony Lake who told them, well, if you want to get it on the radar, you have to make noise. You have to say, hey, this is what's happening. So, and there is a large constituency population of Ukrainians in the United States, I think, which keeps that on the agenda and keeps that alive. So I think that that's also important as well. But yeah, I think in some ways too, it does overshadow some of these other sort of issues that are going on. And then there's other situations as well that we can talk about, but not to lessen the situation in Ukraine.
JoAnn, you mentioned fatigue and atrocity fatigue. You know, you're absolutely right. You know, watching the news, my wife and I, we were glued to it. And then there was some tapering off. I wonder, does that, we mentioned earlier about will, does that tapering off of paying attention or being vocal about it, how does that translate into political will? Because we've talked about, we still see some evidence of political will. How does that, is there a relationship there between that tapering off?
Yeah, Michael, I think, you know, if the public, you know, reaches out to our members of Congress, do something, stop something, call it what it is, you know, let's take some action, then I think they're responsive or receptive to that. But I don't think, you know, people generally hold their elected officials accountable for things like genocidal acts and genocide, et cetera. Even crimes against humanity, we see this. I mean, even myself, I'm guilty of it myself. I have the news on and it's streaming and there's some updates on Ukraine. And I'm not really as focused as I was when this, you know, invasion first began. Unless it takes something like the bombing of a hospital and now these exhumations of these mass graves and things like that. It's almost like the daily report. See what I'm saying? So yeah, I do tend to think people just, you know, we have that short attention span. Now we're moving on to the next thing. I think that detracts in many ways.
And if I may add on here, I think there's two other issues as well. So first is that I think there's some pretty good evidence that foreign policy doesn't drive constituent interest, right? And so, you know, if we think about why is it that Ukraine might receive a lot of attention, just generally, it's because perhaps relative to some of the other cases that JoAnn mentioned, the location of Ukraine, its connection and its geographic location with other European states, with NATO allies, etc. This puts it high up on U.S. foreign policy interests, right? And so this is why it's one of the reasons it's getting a lot of attention, and one of the reasons, if people pay attention to foreign policy, this might be one of the areas that they focus on more so than others, right? Because if they don't pay attention to foreign policy concerns, then concerns that aren't directly related to that foreign policy interest, right, are going to be even lower down the poll, I think, in terms of driving constituent interest and focus and action, to the points that JoAnn made.
David, did you want to build upon that, or I saw your mic was unmuted?
Oh, I've just left it unmuted the whole time. I would just, a simple observation to Michael's point, foreign invasion across state lines gets a lot more attention than a civil war. Civil war seemed like a family's fighting, let them fight it out. But of an invasion, a lot more attention.
Excellent. So our last question before we move into to Q&A, because we did receive some questions I'm hoping that we can get to and hear from everyone's thoughts on. So the final question in for us is, what steps can the international community take to prevent other nations following Russia's lead?
I could get us started on that. So if I think broadly about prevention, usually we think of prevention relying on two factors, influencing the would-be perpetrator's motive, and then also their ability to commit those atrocities. So in a sense, we could think about the perpetrators perceived benefit, right? That's their motive from what they're engaging in, whether that's something based on ideology or whether that's something strategic in the context of war. In either case, and then their perceived costs, right, to these actions. And to reduce motive or benefit, one would have to reduce the threat that the perpetrator faces to its political or physical survival. Again, if this is based on ideology, this could still be threatening from a political sense, right? But in a lot of the cases, these are occurring against the backdrop of armed conflict. So we have the physical survival as well. Problematically, I think reducing threat either means eliminating the threat itself, right, which would be the elimination of the group, at least its armed capacity, or forcing the perpetrator to appease the threat. And eliminating the threat in such a situation, since it's done through militarized force, has its own problems, and appeasing the threat, that might be able to be done politically, but since this is exactly what the perpetrator wishes to avoid, it's unlikely to occur, right? And so I think for these reasons, most of the time we tend to focus on, instead of changing motive, is increasing the perpetrator's costs to committing the atrocities, or the would-be, right? So we're talking about how might we prevent a country from following Russia's lead? So how might we change their costs for engaging in these actions in the future? And I think usually we point to a few different ways. So the first is relying on international law, right? Relying on the ratification of different commitments might increase the cost for committing these atrocities. However, the effect of ratification, I think, is most common in democracies, which are also the states that are least likely to commit these crimes. So that might not be the way to focus our attention, and in many cases, I think another commonly discussed way to do this is the integration of a country into global trade. But that takes time, right? It's the countries that are often on kind of the periphery of the global economic system that are the ones that are engaged, that engage in these crimes. But that's not a quick fix. It takes time to kind of build these bridges. And so finally, the way that people often focus on this is militarized force to oppose the atrocities by increasing the perpetrator's cost to committing them. But this, of course, creates more violence in the short run, right? So this is it has its own problems that we could talk about as well. So if to try to summarize here, if we're thinking long run, then it seems like the international community needs to better integrate countries that are on the periphery of the system, right? This might long-term reduce both the motives within the countries that lead to the conflicts in which atrocities are usually used to address, but it also just might make engaging in these abuses too costly for the actual perpetrator. I think the tougher one is in the short run, right? Usually we emphasize diplomatic or economic means to increasing the cost to engaging in the crimes, and often using these to suggest other pathways forward, right? What are other strategies that a potential perpetrator or someone who's on the cusp might consider when they might be considering engaging in the violence? I think there is some good evidence, though, that completely neutral actions seem to have little, if any, effect, and that this has to be directed, intentional action by actors in the international community.
JoAnn or David, do you have thought to follow up with that?
No, I don't. But I guess I could add that if you think about the Russian case in terms of motive, it is very difficult to undo this deep history that Putin embodies of Europeans invading Russia. They've experienced it for 300 years, and so for NATO to be near his borders, on the one hand, I can understand their anxiety. On the other hand, NATO is a defensive alliance. Europeans don't have an interest in invading Russia, but that's a very difficult motive held by the Russians that would be difficult to undo. And so I appreciate Gary's depiction of the situation as a very difficult one to address.
If I might, so David, forgive me because I'm not sure if this connects directly to your studies, but the situation in Armenia and Azerbaijan right now is one that several people talk about as being a case to really watch in terms of how, in particular, Armenia might approach the situation. Do you have a sense? Is this really along the same lines in terms of motive or ability? Is this really a case that we might see emulation in?
I have to say I'm not up to speed enough on the Armenian-Azerbaijani situation to meaningfully comment.
Excellent. Thank you so much for everyone's participation. We're going to move now into some of the questions because we got a handful of questions from the audience. So I would like to go ahead and start this. David, when you were talking earlier about the history between the Soviet Union or the former Soviet Union and in Ukraine, we received the question of why is it all censored? Why doesn't anyone talk about it anymore?
Why doesn't anybody talk about the Soviet Union anymore?
Well,
or why is censorship so powerful in Russia?
Why? I think if I remember right, the student or the individual asked this question regarding when you were talking about the history and why we're not talking about that famine, that man-made starvation campaign.
Yeah, well, I love having a historical sensibility and sharing it with students. And my kid, like one day in the car on the way to school, my kid asked me, what's up with Iraq? And I thought, okay, I've got like 15 minutes. How far back can I go? So this is my sensibility. For some people, like for Ukrainians, the fact that the famine is designated a genocide, they have a remembrance day, they have memorial installations in the center of Kyiv, that it's a national day of observation. There's not a Ukrainian that doesn't know about it. I guess kind of just depending on where we are in our lives and our kind of what we pay attention to, there's only so many things we can kind of manage in our head. So whatever is kind of right in front of us, sort of like JoAnn was talking about, those are kind of the things that we attend to. So I think in a lot of the news coverage about the war in Ukraine, if people are following it, they do get some sense of that back history, or they did kind of at the beginning. But believe me, there is plenty of information out there. And if people want to follow things from Ukrainian responsible journalistic outfit, there's an English language one called the Kyiv Independent, right? So it's the city Kyiv name and then the word independent. They're doing a really good job covering the war and questions about the Ukrainian past for English readers.
Another question that we received, this is open for the entire panel here. If I'm having to do a little bit of working here, but they're asking what other Soviet or former Soviet countries have experienced genocide? Is it just Ukraine or are there others?
Well, Armenia has experienced genocide, and it's related to the Soviet Union, but perhaps JoAnn or Gary could put that one into context for us. It wasn't necessarily Soviet-inspired genocide, but it's something that affected the Russian state.
Well, if you look at just the Europe or the surrounding areas, I mean, you also had definitely the Armenian genocide. Also, what was I thinking of? I'm trying to like
The Chechen War, maybe?
Well, I'm really trying. I'm looking at trying to get a map in my head in that sense. Yes,
Former Yugoslavia.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, if you think of Yugoslavia as a satellite of the Soviet Union, then yes, definitely I would include Yugoslavia, which is an artificial construct anyway. So, but
one of the things that pops up, I don't believe it's been categorized as a genocide, but Putin organized the second war against Chechen autonomy.
Yeah.
99 to 2005. And in terms of war crimes and crimes against humanity, the same things are evident. Destruction of civilian targets, execution of civilians. They did not completely destroy a Chechen identity. It still exists. And I don't believe it's been characterized as a genocide, although Chechens might feel that it certainly meets the criteria.
And David, I don't know if you want to discuss the Soviets in Afghanistan as well, with the mass indiscriminate targeting of civilians.
Sure. Well, what do you think? Is that, could put it in the war crime category probably for sure. I don't think I haven't seen anything sort of linking, suggesting there was a crossover into genocide, although I imagine if we applied the definition of intent, you clearly see Soviet military working with intent. But have you encountered information on that?
Barbara Harf, the Political Instability Task Force, they call this politicide. So going back to the introduction that Michael gave us, right? So political groups being stripped out of the initial definition of genocide because of that East-West kind of negotiation that went on to what should become the Genocide Convention. We don't, so the cases like Afghanistan wouldn't fit. And so we've seen a broadening of kind of this this definition where Afghanistan is then included there in politicide. And I think if you think more about perhaps changes in legal standards and development, right? We'll hear a lot of discussion around crimes against humanity, war crimes, things that have kind of developed since the Genocide Convention, where if we were to go back in time, I think we would likely see maybe not prosecution, but at least the identification or the indictment of some of the acts.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, another question that we received was, Putin has claimed that the presence of NATO countries near Russia's border necessitated his invasion of Ukraine. Given his thinking, has the United States been drawn into a new Cold War? And does the Ukrainian conflict represent a proxy war within this new global paradigm? How might this affect American foreign policy going forward?
Well, I got to tell you, in kind of just a vernacular way of talking with friends, and they ask about the NATO question, I talk about my neighbor's dog. We have a fence. We have clearly delineated boundaries recognized by Cameron County in the city of Brownsville. And if I walk into my backyard with no intention at all of crossing that boundary, that dog barks like crazy. And it's because the dog has high anxiety. I've since befriended him with trade through the fence of treats. But the fact that the dog is anxious and is going to bark at me, to my mind, doesn't in any way affect. I mean, like I don't need to respond to the dog. I mean, I'm on my own property, my own land. So as far as that analogy goes, and I don't mean to dehumanize Putin by calling him a barking dog, but what's going on, I think, from the Russian political perspective is high anxiety, and it's a trait of Russian political culture going way back. Russian political culture just can't imagine Ukraine as independent, the same way the dog can't imagine that I'm on some invisible side of a border. I guess I could validate Putin's feelings and the feelings of other Russians who feel a threat by NATO. At the same time, I think pragmatically, there's not a threat there. That because Putin and the Russian regime, they're not independent. They're not simply an independent actor. Putin, for 20 years, has actively been trying to what some people jokingly refer to as the Soviet Union 2.0. But more insightfully, if you read what he says and what others say about him, he's trying to recreate a great Russia, the Russian Empire, right, which dominated Poland, Ukraine, from Poland all the way to the Pacific Ocean and south into the Great Game with the English in Afghanistan and so on. That the Russian political imagination is back in the 19th century. And I think in the 20th century, we have many other mechanisms and international ways of thinking about sovereignty and all kinds of communication and trade, immigration and whatnot across borders that, we don't have to invade for territory anymore. There are other ways to solve international problems and issues. So I'm not sure I would call it a new Cold War, although I think the United States, its foreign policy, for good or ill, and it's good in its best iterations, it really is trying to promote democracy and capitalism, because those things link countries together and prevent them from attacking each other, which is that's George Kennan's, containment policy, or it speaks to the containment policy that I thought of George Kennan's containment notes quite a lot at the time of the invasion, and that a lot of it made sense in terms of Kennan being a really astute observer of Russian political psychology and history. So I don't think we've been drawn into a proxy war, because the Americans, Europe is part of our political interest, but we've got no territorial interests at all in Ukraine or in Eastern Europe. I think what Americans are mostly interested in is a smoothly functioning international system. They do get to enjoy an outsized presence in that system, and perhaps it's abused from time to time in terms of violence and capitalism, but it also diminishes violence. So I don't think Ukrainians see themselves as involved in a proxy war. I think they see themselves in an existential crisis about having their own states. I think the Ukrainian general political imagination is about wanting to have an independent state, free of corruption, tied to sort of European practices of government and economic activities, with a guarantee of sovereign independence. And that runs up hard against the Russian revanchist, if you want to call it that, or sort of Russian expansionist sphere of influence political policy. I think the Russians could live very happily within their borders, but that's not where their political imagination is. So perhaps it will lead to a new kind of Cold War. It's a hot war right now for sure. But I'm not sure. I think political crisis in Russia is going to change the equation.
Excellent. So one final question, because time does permit. I want to make sure we're on schedule though. So the question is, again, this is open to everyone. Is it a concern that establishing certainty about whether an action meets every technical and nuanced aspect of the definition of genocide could lead to endless deliberation and inaction or insufficient action during ongoing atrocities? If the legal definition is so ambiguous as to become a barrier to action, does the definition need to be revised? Could it be revised?
So I guess to take a stab at the first couple parts of that question. So if I think of genocide alongside some of the other crimes that have been elevated in the international community, that we're having the development of the responsibility to protect, right? It's not just genocide, right? And so if you think about some of the discussion we've been having as to whether or not these acts amount to genocide, so well, even if not, they are certainly war crimes. They're certainly crimes against humanity. And with responsibility to protect, those crimes carry the same responsibility as genocide, right? So I don't think that we need just to focus on genocide to think about action. However, I would also point out that most of the times that we have seen intervention into ongoing cases of genocide, the motive for intervention was not, is this a genocide or not, right? Most of those interventions were done for strategic purposes, right? Done for, well, refugees are coming across my border, or hey, that's my rival that is targeting those people, or even that's my rival that are targeting an ethnic kin across the border. So the idea that agreeing that this is genocide and now we're going to see action, I don't think is the pattern that we have seen over time in terms of when we see action. So I would suggest that on one hand, if we're concerned about the definitions of genocide leading to an action, well, we still have action on crimes against humanity and war crimes. But even with that, that's not what tends to drive intervention. And so if your concern is more about intervention, then I think we want to look to really the political and military calculus of whether or not to get involved, right? So why not send U.S. troops? Or sorry, not just U.S. troops, but why might NATO countries hesitate to get involved, right? And it might be because the spreading of interstate war in this particular case, right? And we might think of other examples. Vietnam into Cambodia, right? Tanzania into Uganda. These were not about preventing genocide in the sense of we think of that, but rather because the causes of that violence, or rather the consequences of that violence were something that nearby states didn't want to deal with anymore.
Adding on to what Gary said too, I think we shouldn't label interveners always as heroes, especially if the intent is to intervene to stop a genocide, because now what we know about the Rwandan Patriotic Front and the atrocities that they committed when they invaded Rwanda to halt the genocide. They were certainly committed crimes against humanity themselves as well. So.
Excellent. So that concludes with our questioning. Just some final thoughts real quick.
Actually, Dr.
Yes.
Patterson, really briefly, there was a question that came in from one of my students. And so if someone is willing to provide just like a 1-minute answer, I would be really curious to hear it. One of my students sent in a question about the UN and how they've been relatively ineffective at preventing these kinds of acts of violence. And he asked, is there anything that could be done by the UN, or is there any way that any changes that need to be made to the UN that would make it more effective in preventing this kind of political violence? If anyone just has a brief answer, I'd be very curious to hear what you think on that.
So I guess real briefly, the way in which the UN often responds and has been a critique of the UN is that it's reactionary to the violence rather than preventative. And so if I think of a case in which we saw a country that was thought to be on the brink of civil war or even genocide move off the brink was Burundi in 2014, 2015. And what led to this was a lot of local regional mediation early on. So it seems to be local actors with high degrees of interest in the conflict and knowledge of the conflict providing that support early rather than waiting for the violence to take place seems to work. I think the one kind of hard thing, if I'm just going to make the point a little bit, so that's kind of the point, but a little bit longer is just in terms of knowing. One of the hard things is we don't exactly have a great understanding of cases that are likely or not likely to see genocide, and then to understand the treatment of the UN on those cases. So we often criticize the UN for its actions, but one of the things that I don't know, right, is do we actually have a great sample, if you will, of cases that are really on the brink? Burundi is one that we talked about, but who really did the UN help or not help, I think is a question that needs further investigation.
Thank you for that. Sorry, Michael, you can go ahead now.
Oh, no, thank you so much. That was an interesting question. So some final thoughts as we are coming to an end of Genocide Awareness Day. First, I would like to thank Kristen for all of her contributions and for assisting with today's program. Thank you so much, Kristen. I also want to thank our panelists for today for their expertise and their time in joining us today. This has truly been insightful, meaningful, and no doubt, definitely meaningful. So I just want to say thank you so very much. Here is also email addresses and names for the panelists. If anyone has any questions or concerns, or thought of a question, please feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we'd be more than happy to address that. And lastly, I just want to say thank you to the audience. Genocide profoundly demonstrates how dark and barbaric humanity can be toward one another. But a public armed with knowledge and the will to stand against that darkness, we can be a beacon of light and a helping hand to those who are suffering. Learning is the first step because knowledge entices action, action demands accountability, and accountability brings prevention. This concludes this year's program. We hope to see you again next year. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for being here.